Ladies and gentlemen, if you thought nations today held back because of diplomatic niceties, if you believe that moral high ground is preserved only by talk, not action, then the past few weeks have thrown every assumption upside down. Because India just did what no other country dared. It struck with precision, it spoke with action, and it forced even the greatest superpower to sit up and take notice. What prompted this seismic shift? A barbaric terror attack in Pahalgam took innocent lives. And instead of issuing another statement, India decided it would respond, not rashly, but with calculated firmness. India launched what it termed Operation Sindoor, targeting known terror infrastructure in Pakistan and Pakistan-administered territory. No civilian or military installations beyond those terror camps were struck. The aim was clear: send a message: Pakistan's backing or harboring of terrorists will no longer be tolerated. The Times of India fly one. The US, usually quick to warn, to mediate, even to lecture, suddenly found itself constrained, not by lack of power but by respect, because diplomacy without consequences often rings hollow. Deeds demand recognition. Washington has had to shift its posture, monitoring, talking, but also acknowledging that India is no longer content to be silent victim or mere complainer. Wikipedia 2AP News FO. But this isn't just about retaliation. There's a new principle in play. Terror and talks can't go together. Dialogue will follow only from strength, not from appeasement. And that changes everything. Whether you are a neighbor, an ally, or someone watching from afar, India's message is actions will back words. AP News, and it's not alone. From Russia to America, voices are rising that India's stance is deserved, that when terror strikes, inaction is complicity. Global opinion is shifting. Alliances will recalibrate. This is not about hostility, it's about responsibility, deterrence, and about the idea that a large democracy can stand firm without being ostracized for refusing to be a victim. The Times of India +1. So here's where we stand now. Are we witnessing a new chapter in India's foreign policy? One written not in concessions, but in clear strategic resolve. I believe we are, because what India has just done is not merely striking terror camps. It is declaring enough is enough, that the international rules of engagement around sovereignty and terror are being rewritten. That peace without justice, security without strength, are no longer acceptable. India's decisive retaliation through what has come to be known as Operation Sindoor was not a rash display of power, but a carefully calibrated response to an act of terror that shook the conscience of the nation. The Pahalgam attack, which left innocent civilians and security personnel dead, was not just another strike from across the border, it was the tipping point. For years, India had tolerated provocations, condemned them in international forums, and waited for the world to act. Yet the same cycle repeated itself: condemnation, promises of cooperation, and then silence. This time, however, India chose not to be trapped in that cycle. It decided that words were not enough, that only action could reset the narrative. That action was Operation Sindoor. Unlike past retaliations that were largely symbolic, this operation carried a sharper message. The targets were not random, nor were they meant to provoke a larger military confrontation. Instead, India struck directly at the roots of terrorism, hitting specific terror camps and training facilities that were known to operate under the patronage of Pakistani intelligence networks. Precision was key. By ensuring that the strikes were limited to terror infrastructure and avoided civilian or military installations, India underscored that this was not an attack on Pakistan's sovereignty, but a strike on Pakistan's duplicity. It separated the people of Pakistan from the terror machine that operates within its territory, placing accountability exactly where it belonged. The very name of the operation carried symbolism. Sindoor, a sacred red powder in Indian culture, often represents both protection and strength. Choosing such a title wasn't merely about military codename efficiency, it was about sending a cultural, civilizational message. This was not an isolated strike, it was an assertion of India's right to defend its people, its soldiers, and its soil, no matter who stood in opposition. The timing, too, was deliberate. India acted swiftly after the Pahalgam attack, signaling that there would no longer be long delays, bureaucratic hesitations, or timid diplomatic calculations. Internationally, the impact was immediate. The United States, accustomed to positioning itself as mediator in South Asian crises, found itself in an unusual place, watching and acknowledging rather than dictating. The Biden administration's public response was restrained. It spoke of monitoring the situation and engaging diplomatically, but behind the carefully chosen words lay a recognition of a new reality. India was not playing the role of a passive partner waiting for approval. It was asserting itself as an autonomous power capable of making hard decisions. The shock in Washington was not anger, but surprise. Surprise at the decisiveness and at the growing international support that followed. Russia, France, and even sections of European leadership expressed quiet understanding, if not outright endorsement. The line was becoming cleared in an age where terrorism is a global cancer. A nation has the right, indeed the duty, to excise it from its borders. By conducting Operation Sindoor in a controlled but firm manner, India avoided reckless escalation while still demonstrating it would not bend. This balance of restraint and resolve is what made the retaliation truly decisive. Domestically, the operation reshaped public confidence. For ordinary Indians who had long felt that terror attacks were met with hollow words, Operation Sindoor was proof that their government had drawn a new line in the sand. It was more than a military maneuver, it was a psychological turning point. It told citizens that their security was not negotiable, that those who orchestrated violence would face consequences, and that national dignity was not a bargaining chip in diplomatic games. Operation Sindoor was therefore not just an answer to one terror strike. It was a redefinition of India's security posture, a declaration that the country would now respond with clarity, precision, and strength whenever its sovereignty was challenged. In doing so, India broke a precedent that had kept it tied to cautious restraint for decades. It dared to act, and in doing so, it startled not only its adversaries but even its allies. The aftershocks of that choice continue to ripple across the global stage, proving that this was not a momentary retaliation, but a statement of intent for the future. When India carried out Operation Sindoor, the reverberations were felt instantly in Washington. For decades, the United States had considered itself the key player in South Asia, the mediator that could step in whenever tensions rose between India and Pakistan. Yet this time the script was different. The United States did not preemptively caution restraint, nor did it rush to broker a ceasefire. Instead, its initial reaction was one of shock. Shock that India had moved so decisively without seeking consultation, and shock that it had executed a precision operation with such confidence. The diplomatic language from the White House was measured, but beneath the restraint lay a recognition that something fundamental had shifted in the region. Statements from U.S. officials focused on monitoring the situation closely and encouraging dialogue between both nations. This was the standard diplomatic playbook, yet the tone carried a subdued acknowledgement of India's growing assertiveness. Unlike in the past, when Washington would have been quick to issue warnings of escalation, this time the emphasis was different. It was on recognizing India's right to defend itself, while still cautioning against wider conflict. The nuance mattered. For a superpower accustomed to setting the rules, it was unusual to watch a partner take bold action unilaterally, and then force the U.S. to adapt to its pace rather than the other way around. Privately, the administration was reportedly surprised at the timing and precision of the strikes. Analysts in Washington who had long advocated for stronger counter-terrorism cooperation with India found their arguments validated. They noted that India had effectively drawn a red line. Terror attacks would no longer be met with symbolic rhetoric. In the corridors of the Pentagon and the State Department, there was an acceptance that India had matured into a security actor in its own right, one that could no longer be expected to merely absorb provocations while waiting for the U.S. to step in with diplomatic tools. The reaction in Congress also reflected this recalibration. While some voices urged caution, fearing escalation with a nuclear-armed Pakistan, others strongly supported India's right to retaliate against terror infrastructure. Bipartisan recognition of India's strategic importance played a role here. In an era where Washington increasingly views Beijing as its primary challenger, India's rise as a self-confident regional power is not seen as a threat, but as a necessary counterbalance. Operation Sindoor, therefore, did not just stun policymakers, it also reminded them that India's trajectory as a global power could no longer be contained within old frameworks of dependency. Media commentary in the United States echoed this tension between surprise and respect. Major networks reported the strikes as evidence of India's shifting security posture, pointing out that America's traditional warnings had been replaced by a more watchful stance. Analysts highlighted that even though Washington was monitoring closely, there was no strong condemnation of India's action. Instead, there was an implicit acknowledgement that the country had the right to act against terrorism, and that such moves aligned with broader global security interests. This subtle but significant change in tone was not lost on observers worldwide. What truly shocked America was not just the operation itself, but the confidence with which it was carried out. India did not frame its actions as reactive or apologetic. It framed them as decisive and necessary, forcing Washington to recognize that the old dynamic, where the U.S. held the reins of South Asian security, was slipping away. Diplomacy was still alive, but the balance of initiative had shifted. India was setting the terms, and America was responding. For a country long accustomed to being the first mover in regional crises, this reversal was striking. As diplomatic cables moved between Washington, New Delhi, and Islamabad, the message became clear: America would continue to engage, but it would do so from a new position, one where it could no longer dictate outcomes as it once did. India had rewritten the expectations of how it would respond to threats, and in doing so, it had shocked the very superpower that had long assumed it would remain cautious and restrained. The US was now learning that in this new era, diplomacy must walk alongside decisiveness, not in place of it. For decades, India's engagement with its volatile neighbor had been marked by a frustrating paradox. Dialogue would continue even as terror attacks disrupted lives and claimed innocent victims. The pattern was predictable. After every strike, there would be outrage, condemnation, high-level meetings, and then a return to talks under international pressure. The cycle gave space for perpetrators to regroup and rearm, while victims were left wondering whether justice would ever extend beyond words. But with the aftermath of the Pahalgam attack and the decisive strikes under Operation Sindoor, India has drawn a bold new line in the sand. The message is unambiguous: terror and talks cannot coexist. If there is bloodshed instigated by groups operating across the border, there will be no handshakes, no diplomatic pleasantries, and no return to business as usual. This new threshold represents a fundamental change in how India defines its national interest. It is not a rejection of dialogue as a tool of diplomacy, but a demand for sincerity in the conditions that make dialogue meaningful. Talks without accountability are hollow. Negotiations while terror networks flourish are pointless. India's leadership has decided that the credibility of its foreign policy cannot rest on endless patience while terrorists exploit its restraint. Instead, any attempt at dialogue must now be conditional. First, eliminate terror safe havens, dismantle networks, and show proof of good faith, then step to the table. Anything less will be dismissed as theater. This stance resonates strongly within India's borders. Public opinion has long been wary of what many call dialogue fatigue. Citizens have watched the cycle of attack and appeasement repeat too often, eroding trust not only in the neighbor across the border, but in the governments willing to entertain talks despite the blood still fresh on the ground. By articulating a clear doctrine that terror and talks cannot go together, the government has tapped into a widespread sense of justice. It has told its people that peace will not be pursued at the cost of dignity, and that national security is not a bargaining chip. For many, this is not just foreign policy, it is moral clarity. On the international stage, this new threshold challenges traditional diplomatic instincts. Western powers, often eager to push dialogue as the only path forward, must now contend with a country unwilling to bend to that formula. India is not rejecting peace, it is redefining the terms under which peace can be pursued. By refusing to sit at the same table with a state that enables or shelters terrorists, India is signaling that peace without accountability is no peace at all. This position, once seen as risky, is increasingly gaining recognition in a world that has grappled with its own terrorist threats. Nations that once counseled restraint are now quietly acknowledging that India's line is not only justifiable but necessary. The strategic implication of this threshold is profound. It puts pressure directly on Pakistan's leadership, stripping away the comfortable duality of supporting terror while presenting itself as a willing participant in dialogue. If Pakistan wishes to re-enter diplomatic conversations, it must first dismantle the very infrastructure it has long denied but quietly enabled. The old game of double speak, one hand offering talks while the other shelters militants, is being called out for what it is. India's refusal to play along effectively corners Islamabad, leaving fewer escape routes for plausible deniability. But the implications go beyond South Asia. Other nations battling extremism are watching closely. By asserting that dialogue and terror cannot coexist, India is setting a precedent that could influence global counterterrorism norms. It demonstrates that democracies need not sacrifice firmness for diplomacy, that peace processes can be protected by drawing red lines rather than blurring them. And for countries tired of endless negotiations with actors who operate in bad faith, this approach offers an alternative model, one of strength paired with conditional openness. What makes this threshold even more significant is its timing. India is no longer a struggling regional power pleading for recognition. It is a rising global force whose economy, military, and diplomatic weight cannot be ignored. When it declares that terror and talks cannot coexist, it is not a desperate demand but a confident assertion. It is not asking the world to understand its pain, it is telling the world to respect its resolve. This subtle but powerful difference is what has startled allies and adversaries alike. In drawing this line, India has not closed the door on diplomacy. Rather, it has reframed it. Talks remain possible, but only when trust is built on action, not empty words. Until then, there will be no pretense of civility masking the brutality of terrorism. By holding firm to this principle, India is not just protecting its own citizens. It is reshaping the very logic of conflict resolution in an age where terror has too often been normalized as part of political strategy. The aftermath of Operation Sindoor revealed something striking. India's boldness did not leave it isolated but instead drew unprecedented backing from global powers. What many skeptics assumed would bring condemnation or calls for restraint instead brought a wave of understanding, and in some cases outright support. From Washington to Moscow, from European capitals to Asian allies, the consensus was surprisingly unified. India's actions were not reckless, they were justified. This response underscores how global attitudes toward terrorism and regional stability have shifted, and how India's growing stature is reshaping diplomatic equations. Russia, a long-standing partner with deep defense ties to New Delhi, was among the first to express solidarity. Moscow's position carried weight, not only because of history but because Russia maintains its own complicated relationship with Pakistan. Its willingness to side with India on the matter sent a clear message. Fighting terrorism takes precedence over balancing diplomatic niceties. This reaffirmation of trust between India and Russia also demonstrated that old alliances are not fading in the wake of shifting geopolitics, but are being recalibrated to match present realities. The United States, despite its initial shock, did not fall back on the old habit of publicly equating India and Pakistan. Instead, while emphasizing caution, American officials acknowledged India's right to defend itself. This was more than a linguistic adjustment. It was a tacit recognition that India's role as a security actor in Asia is indispensable, especially as Washington seeks stronger partners to counterbalance Beijing's rise. By not chastising New Delhi, America effectively signaled to the world that it was willing to accept India's new assertiveness as part of the global security architecture. European nations followed with their own statements of support, often framed through the language of counter-terrorism cooperation. France, in particular, a close strategic partner of India, stood firm in its backing, pointing out that no country should be expected to tolerate repeated acts of terror without consequence. For the European Union, which has faced its own terrorist attacks over the past decade, India's posture resonated with their experience. By aligning with India, they reinforced the broader principle that sovereignty includes not just the right but the obligation to protect citizens from cross-border violence. Perhaps most significant was the response from the broader global South. Countries in Africa, Latin America, and parts of Asia expressed admiration for India's decision to take matters into its own hands. Many of these nations have long complained about double standards in the international system, where the security concerns of the West receive immediate recognition, while their own struggles against extremism are sidelined. India's defiance, coupled with the lack of strong pushback from major powers, emboldened these countries to see New Delhi as a voice that challenges the old order and speaks for a more equitable approach to global security. The geopolitical implications of this episode are wide-ranging. For Pakistan, the isolation was stark. Instead of rallying diplomatic sympathy, it found itself cornered, with few allies willing to defend its position. China, its closest backer, offered predictable words of caution, but stopped short of meaningful action, mindful of its own economic and strategic calculations. This left Islamabad in a weakened position, forced to reckon with the reality that the world was no longer willing to indulge its narrative of victimhood, while terror networks thrived on its soil. For India, the implications are far more empowering. By receiving backing from both traditional allies like Russia and newer partners like the United States, it has reinforced its image as a bridge between competing blocs. At a time of increasing polarization in global politics, India demonstrated that its strategic autonomy allows it to act decisively without alienating either side. This balancing act enhances its credibility as a rising power capable of shaping outcomes rather than merely reacting to them. The long-term consequence is a recalibration of expectations. The world has now seen India's willingness to break precedent and act decisively in defense of its people. That precedent cannot be ignored. Future provocations will be viewed through the lens of this new doctrine, and potential adversaries will have to consider the likelihood of swift and targeted retaliation. At the same time, allies and partners will measure their cooperation with India in recognition of its growing role as a global stabilizer. In the broader strategic context, Operation Sindoor has also injected momentum into multilateral security frameworks. Counter-terrorism cooperation, intelligence sharing, and joint military exercises are now being discussed with renewed urgency, not just as routine gestures but as practical measures to address a shared threat. India, by taking a bold step, has effectively elevated itself to the position of a frontline state in the global war against terror. A role that comes with both responsibility and influence. By daring to act when many would only deliberate, India has reshaped the global conversation. The backing it has received is not just about sympathy for its loss, but respect for its resolve. The geopolitical consequences will echo far beyond South Asia, influencing alliances, shaping strategies, and redefining what it means to be a responsible power in a world where the line between diplomacy and security grows ever thinner. Let every leader around the world, from New Delhi to Washington, from Islamabad to capitals in Europe, take note: the era of speaking while trembling is over. In a world of grey zones, India has chosen a sharp line, and that line reverberates far beyond its borders. If you are watching this and thinking this is only about one country, you're wrong. It's about principle, about courage, about the audacity to act when most will only talk. India just did what no other country dared. And now, even America is shocked. Let that be remembered not as a moment of tension, but as a moment of truth. Thank you.